One of the longest currently running issues in gaming is the concept of digital versus physical, primarily in the sense that there are a lot of people who still want to hold on to physical as their primary option, but clearly a lot of companies are trying to drive things towards an all-digital future. And despite the fact that they want that, we've been getting lots and lots of great reasons why we maybe don't want that to happen just yet. Whether that's situations of games getting delisted, like with Nintendo making games only temporarily available on the Switch, PlayStation wanting to close down digital storefronts, or even as a much more recent example, Xbox's problems with DRM, where a lot of people, thanks to server issues, weren't even able to play games they digitally owned on their home console, despite the fact that that's not the way that's supposed to work. The thing is, while digital absolutely has a lot of problems that needs to be addressed, I sometimes feel like people talk up physical media as if it is this completely perfect alternative that has no problems whatsoever, which honestly just isn't the case. I mean, given the choice between two extremes and only being able to have either only physical or digital, yeah, I lean towards physical, but honestly, we've been living in this golden age where we have access to both, and it's really helping highlight what problems and strengths they each have. Thinking about this a lot lately, partially because of, again, the ongoing issues with how digital games have worked out on certain fronts and delisting and losing access to some games that were only ever made available digitally, which is absolutely painful, but also because of the fact that there are already platforms that exist that have more or less already fully embraced all digital. I mean, look at the Steam Deck, for instance. I've been making videos on that and messing with it, and that is not a system that supports any kind of physical media. You know, for the past 5 years, I've really been juggling between the two forms of media in my own life, and I've kind of embraced this balance that makes sense to at least me mentally. PlayStation and Nintendo, if there is a physical option available, I'm basically always taking it. I've even had the situation a few times where a game comes out digitally, I grab it there, and then I grab it again when a physical copy drops later. In fact, I just did this recently with Sifu. Whereas with Xbox, I have actually really embraced an all-digital lifestyle, and part of that is because of wanting to actually really compare those two ecosystems and just have the experience going with them, and also the fact that out of the three companies right now, Xbox really has pushed more toward that kind of all-digital future. And not just in the sense of having an all-digital system with the Xbox Series S, which PlayStation does have their own option with the PlayStation 5 all-digital version, but also things like Game Pass, Quick Resume, features that really only work when you embrace playing more stuff digitally versus relying on physical media. It's also a little weird because, to be honest, the kind of games that I pick up on each system also really kind of identifies with why I like getting one physically or digitally. Xbox, for instance, I really use a lot more for sort of just trying a lot of different stuff, especially with things that are on Game Pass. Games that aren't necessarily, you know, the things I'm traditionally always into, or, you know, things that are big franchises that I want to play and experience, but I don't necessarily have an attachment to being able to go back and play however many years later. Whereas PlayStation and Nintendo, there are a lot of franchises that I have this very almost traditionalist mindset of, where it's like, oh, well, I have all these physical copies of these older ones, I want to keep this train going and really be able to go back to a lot of these games whenever I want, especially for certain franchises where I feel like I do have that interest in playing older entries. I mean, even just recently, I've been going back and playing a lot of older Square Enix titles, a lot of which have been made available digitally on modern systems, because Square Enix is actually pretty good about that, but there's a lot of stuff that also still is trapped on older systems that I like to revisit and experience. And it's really interesting to me that focusing on one form of media over the other also really changes my habits with how I approach and play certain games. Xbox, for instance, I find myself being very easily able to just constantly juggle games. And when I say that, I mean I'm kind of taking time and putting it into each of these different titles all at once and never really fully dedicating to one or the other. Whereas on PlayStation or even Switch, a lot of times, aside from smaller indie games, anything that I have a physical copy of, I'm much more likely to, you know, it's already in the system, I'm trying to make progress, let's just push ahead and really try and get this done. And it really does push me in this direction of actually completing games more often on those platforms. You know, I find myself starting and visiting a much larger breadth of games on Xbox, and a lot of times discovering stuff that I may not have actually ever given a shot on the other platforms. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily always finishing those unless they're very small, bite-sized experiences. Obviously, there are exceptions to this in both cases. Xbox, I actually went on a spree of playing all the Yakuza games, and I did play each of them to completion. And Nintendo, I absolutely have a lot of games I haven't finished because the portable nature of it really does make me want to play certain things at different times and jump around a little more with that. The other thing, though, these experiences have really started to train into me, and I've also become a lot more hyper-aware of because of the kind of issues going on right now, is really appreciating how much of a golden era we live in at this moment. We have the benefit of the vast majority of games coming out in both a physical and digital manner, and having the ability to choose between those and gaining the benefits of both being available. You know, when I think about the concept of an all-digital future, it's not one that I'm particularly excited about, but if I'm being honest, at the same time, I'm not that big of a fan of also looking back at when games were only purely physical. It's great if you grew up during that time and were able to amass a collection of things and hold on to them, and it has that very kind of strong nostalgic appeal, but it doesn't really work out in terms of large scale, keeping this stuff around for people to play and experience, because I don't know if you guys have paid attention at all to the retro market lately, it's not exactly cheap. There are so many incredible games that are just outlandishly expensive to try and buy, and in many cases those games have not been made available digitally on any storefront or any modern system at all. The only way to really experience those games, at least via an official means, is to track down and buy a physical copy, and oftentimes easily spending triple digits. And so yeah, physical is awesome when it's stuff that's being released alongside your adventures in gaming and you're keeping up with everything as it's coming out. But the prospect of always having to be afraid of, when something ends up becoming more rare, whether or not they're making a lot of copies of things, or just discovering something that you've never heard of before that was a great game that came out 25 years ago and turns out is really hard to get a hold of right now, just really does help highlight the potential benefits that digital offers. There are so many games that I love that have been re-released digitally in some format where I have that ability to tell someone, hey, this is a great game that's hard to find physically nowadays, but you can get on a digital store for only this much. I definitely recommend checking it out. I mean, just recently I did a video talking about Xbox back-compat games, where there were a lot of titles that, if it wasn't for back-compat, would still be locked on these older systems, but thanks to it, you're able to buy them digitally on a storefront right now. I mean, the idea of something like Guardian Heroes, for instance, just being gone because it was only on the Sega Saturn and then got re-released digitally only on Xbox 360 and then never came back anywhere else, is really frustrating, and I'm glad that it's been made available as a way for people to find and experience it still. All that said though, obviously, there's a lot of stuff about going all digital that completely scares me too. I mean, the prospect of games being delisted for one reason or another, whether that's because a company decided never to renew a copyright on something, like with Alpha Protocol, a beautiful, gorgeous train wreck of a game that came out on PS3 and 360 that you can't buy digitally anymore anywhere because it never got music copyright stuff renewed, and so it just doesn't exist digitally, you have to find it physical. Or even times where companies want to just completely wipe the existence of certain games because they feel like it, like with what happened with Konami and PT. And obviously there's even just that most kind of basic simple question of, do you even really own games that you've bought digitally? I mean, conceptually it seems like you should, right? Because you bought and paid for something and you now have access to that license, but time and time again we keep seeing these weird situations where things are either delisted, removed, not available for re-download, or in some cases simply not work because again, servers are down, and for whatever reason, that's an important step in making sure that you can play something that you paid good money for to own. When we're talking about stuff like this, one thing that you just have to kind of reflect on and accept is that some of these experiences are eventually just going to be temporal. Even when we put all our efforts into trying to keep them available in some format, there's always going to be situations that come up where something is simply lost to history. And it absolutely sucks. And we're never going to be able to keep all of this stuff forever around, but knowing that and really going into this direction of, again, digital becoming something that companies want to push a lot more, I think it's just really important to help drive that awareness of knowing that that's how these things work and trying to save all the stuff that we can. This is part of the reason why preservation has been such a really big talking point lately, right? Is that it's that combination of realizing how a lot of old physical stuff doesn't necessarily equal the same thing as availability. Sure, you as an individual can own something because you've already had it for a while, but if you're interested in trying to get something farther down the line, it just becomes more and more difficult with the passage of time. But at the same time, we're also seeing the issue of how digital is not being handled properly and running into similar issues that honestly don't entirely make sense, other than the fact that things just weren't planned to last as long as we're realizing digital can allow for. If I had the ability to just always have access to one format or the other, I would definitely be picking physical, because I like the option of actually physically owning a thing, but that's just ultimately not the world we live in. Not even talking about the direction that console gaming is going. Again, you look at PC gaming where digital has just become the mainline standard, and that is how everything works. And while I plan to cling to my physical copies as absolutely long as I can and build my little dragon's hoard of curated games that I want to hold on to, I really do honestly think it's not something that's going to last. I know this has been a kind of alarmist talk almost every single gaming generation generation where we talk about, oh yes, digital's the future and physical's going away, and it hasn't quite happened yet. And yeah, I agree that a lot of times people have tried calling attention to that way sooner than it's actually happening. But it is an eventuality. It may not be in 5 years, it may not be in 10 years, it may not even be in the next 30 years. But in the future, digital is absolutely going to become the main line, with physical options being something that's relegated a little more to maybe just special collector's editions. And even then, it's not going to work out the same because the hardware playing these things might not even support a physical media type to read outside of a memory card. You know, I wish I could give some kind of simple solution that would just immediately tackle and fix these issues moving forward, but it's a complex thing in a very large industry that's just not always going to respond to the exact whims of what every single player out there wants. The best I can say is it's just important to really stay aware of these kind of issues and situations, and whenever things are going wrong, call companies out on it. It was right to point out that people did not want the PlayStation storefronts closed down. It was right to call out Nintendo when they were delisting games that could have just stayed available digitally, and it was right to call out Xbox most recently for their DRM issues that are honestly much more aggressive than they need to be. Because an all-digital future is very potentially a not great thing, but it also could be something a lot better than I think some people are giving credit for. It just needs to be done right. So those were just some thoughts on the whole physical versus digital thing. I just kind of felt like doing a rant about that after a few different recent bits of news and some experiences I've been having on things. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know. If you didn't like it for whatever reason, hit thumbs down as well. It's always good for me to know, even though you guys can't see that ratio, I can. And if you haven't subscribed yet, maybe think about doing that. I got a lot more great stuff on the way soon, and I will see you guys later.